Unprecedented youth-led protests against the government and the monarchy are gathering pace in Thailand. We ask a government spokesperson if Prime Minister Prayut Chan-o-cha's time is up. But first, is New Zealand too soft on China? In this week's headliner, we challenge the country's first female Indigenous foreign minister, Nanaia Mahuta, and ask her how to bring more Indigenous voices to the table. Nanaia Mahuta, thank you so much for joining us on UpFront. I want to begin with your country's biggest trading partner. Of course, that is China. China is a country that has been accused of numerous human rights violations, especially in recent years, from the detention of the Uyghur Muslims to the government's crackdown on Hong Kong. Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern has referred to the treatment of Uyghurs as an example of different approaches. Even some of your closest allies have said that you're too weak on China. Are they right? Has New Zealand been too soft on China in order to protect trade?
Well, we have a mature relationship with China, and what that means is that we're able to, in a very consistent way, promote the values and the things that we believe in, and are able to have the difficult conversations with China. And it's important to ensure that as we mature our relationship, there's an understanding about our stance on human rights issues and the values that we uphold in terms of the way that we treat people and an open democracy, being fair. And we're working towards, by and large, advocacy for greater stability and peace within our region. That's well understood by China, and it's important as we navigate our way through the relationship with China, because we have a significant population here in New Zealand and they are our largest trading partner, that we can continue to have dialogue.
Is that enough?
Well, you've got to understand New Zealand's very aware of our place in the world. We're a country in the Pacific, and we have deep connections across the Pacific. And the way in which we navigate our relationship with China as our largest trading partner and are able to express our views based on the values that we hold are delicately balanced. And it's important that we continue to assert the breadth of those issues.
Okay, you're talking about the part of the world where New Zealand is, so let's stay there for a moment. Over the past decade, there has been significant documentation about evidence of crimes against humanity committed in West Papua. That territory, of course, is administered by Indonesia. It's home to more than 1 million Indigenous peoples. Anywhere from 100,000 to 500,000 people have been killed there since the 1960s, and it's actually difficult to get a really clear number because of restrictions on international observers. There's also been reports of systematic rape and violence against women. Do you support independence for West Papua?
I support greater autonomy, and we're not in a position to tell countries what to do, but we are in a position to advocate what we believe underpins an open democracy that builds bridges between Indigenous peoples and the government within their country, and we bring perspective to that. And importantly, the way we treat women and children, and as a result of the impact of COVID-19, deepening the resilience of economic recovery so that many more people within country can benefit. Now, we can share that perspective across the world and in our region based on what we do as a country, and we are in a strong position to do that.
So New Zealand remains the only major buyer of phosphate from the Western Sahara. Your government has not recognized Moroccan sovereignty in that region, yet it continues to be one of the biggest importers of phosphate. Should New Zealand really continue to be involved in a blood trade that fuels human rights abuses and geopolitical tensions?
Look, we're trying very hard within the primary sector of our economy to move towards regenerative farming and being more cognizant of the impact of farming activity on the land. But right at this moment, private companies are sourcing phosphate from other areas. We've got to remember they are private companies, and views have been expressed to them about how to support the transformation that we're seeking across the primary production sector to move towards regenerative farming practices, and therefore the less of a reliance on phosphate.
So when you say transformation, does that mean that you would like for New Zealand not to be involved in this?
over time, but it's not going to be something that can happen overnight. Our economy is significantly vested in the success of our primary productive sector under our government in the last 3 years and going forward. Our Minister of Primary Industries has released Te Taio, Fit for a Better Future, which promotes the types of activities in terms of primary production, ways in which we can move to improve our impact on the environment while still being very productive, sending goods to market for a high value. But this is not going to happen overnight.
Last week, your country declared a climate change emergency and committed to a carbon neutral government by 2025. The Prime Minister Ardern, said the country must act with urgency, her exact words. That sounds great, right? But a carbon neutral government in 4 years, is that actually enough? Because experts have said that New Zealand's lack of action to date is embarrassing and untenable. Your net emissions have risen 60% over the past 20 years. So what does acting with urgency look like in what you all have declared an emergency?
Well, by showing leadership in what we do have control over across the public sector. So we can move the government fleet of vehicles, for example, to electrical vehicles, which will make a significant difference across our small country. We can send a signal that we are going to phase out coal boilers, which again will make a difference. And we can ensure that the building standard has a green code, so that, again, greater efficiency. So we're dealing with what we know we can do as a government to show leadership and then influence the private sector and other parts of our society to say, if we can work together on our ambition to tackle the challenge of climate change in a very local way, then our kids and their kids will benefit. And again, this is making sure we keep up momentum to the challenge that is affecting us all around the world.
So it sounds like you're describing trying to set an example and hoping that the private sector and other companies will come along, but might they need some nudging?
Obviously, they will need some nudging, but we're experiencing the same storm as the whole world is in terms of the COVID-19 response, and it took a team of 5 million to join that effort. And the urgency with which we address what we can do in relation to climate change will take that same effort.
So should New Zealand's environmental policies include a ban on mining iron sand off the North Island's Taranaki coast? So Maori maintain customary claims, as you know, to the foreshore and have opposed the plan for years. How do you reconcile the rights of your people when you're in a role that requires you to defend the government of New Zealand?
Well, our government actually drew a line in the sand in terms of offshore mining. So we're stopping future permits in that industry. We are helping the region that are most, reliant on the mining industry to transition, and we are investing in green energy so that, again, at a practical level, regions and people will not suffer as a result of our ambition to ensure that New Zealand is making a contribution to its climate change effort and how that affects us locally.
So it was back in 2004 when you did create a bit of controversy when you eventually voted for the New Zealand Foreshore and Seabed Act. I mean, that's something that the UN criticized. They released a report on that law stating that the law contained discriminatory aspects against the Maori. You were the chairperson of Maori Affairs at the time. Do you regret that vote?
No, I don't. And that comment was made when the bill was introduced into Parliament, and there were many iterations before its final passing. And time has passed in relation to other legislation that has come in to try and address that issue. I can say that my mandate at the time was put to my electorate, and they continued to support me because there was a way through. We have a treaty settlement process that was not affected by the foreshore and seabed issue. So, you've got to appreciate New Zealand's history and context and the local issues to understand what the final outcome was, and it hasn't stopped people, certainly within my electorate, from advocating for their interests.
You've been a member of New Zealand's parliament since you were 26 years old. You are the first female Indigenous foreign minister of a country that is increasingly becoming a model of diversity really for the world. How will you navigate a world of foreign affairs that for centuries has been dominated by men and colonial powers?
Navigate is the right word. Here in Polynesia, the Māori arrived in New Zealand on voyaging vessels, traversed the Pacific, and accumulated a whole body of knowledge in terms of being able to weather different storms and read the elements. And we're living in some very complex times in terms of international relations and politics, geopolitical politics. So I'll deploy all of that skill set to be able to support the positioning of New Zealand, deepen our relationships, diversify our relationships, and consolidate what we want to see here in the Pacific, which is greater stability, economic resilience, and the well-being of our peoples. Open democracy, which is fair and just.
You've also become the first woman in Parliament to have a traditional Maori chin tattoo, the mokokowai. As Foreign Minister, you're now on a much bigger international stage. Given the prejudice and the ignorance around Indigenous cultures, was that a difficult decision for you to get that tattoo? And do you see this now as an opportunity really to educate a larger audience about Maori culture?
It is an opportunity to educate a larger audience, but it's also a statement that here in New Zealand, shifting attitudes towards Māori as Indigenous peoples has not happened overnight. It's been a journey, but we have a generation now of young Māori growing up who know their language, are connected to their people, and are very confident about how they express the values that we have as Māori within our own country. We can offer a lot in terms of perspective to support other countries in the way that they treat their Indigenous people. Again, New Zealand is not in a position to tell other countries what to do, but if we share our context and our perspective, our experience and the journey that we've taken, I'm sure that there are lots of things that other countries can draw encouragement from, that this is the way forward.
And that'll be the final word. Nanaia Mahuta, thank you so much for joining us.
Tēnā koe, kia ora.
Dinosaur costumes, giant rubber ducks, a protest leader known as Penguin, and a salute inspired by the Hollywood blockbuster, The Hunger Games. These have all been features of massive student-led protests that have rocked Thailand for months. But beyond the quirky symbols lies serious opposition to the government and, for the first time since Thailand became a constitutional monarchy in 1932, opposition to the king. Protesters are demanding the resignation of Prime Minister Prayut Chan-o-cha and for reforms to the monarchy that would reduce the king's power. But is the country's military royalist establishment even listening to them? To help us answer this, we're joined by the government spokesperson, Anucha Burapachaisri. Thank you for joining me on UpFront. Thailand is no stranger to protests, but it's the calls for reform to the monarchy that make these so different. So these protests are aimed at your government as well, but I'm sure you would be the first to point out that the government and the monarchy, they are separate entities. So just to be clear, what is the government's position on the reforms to the monarchy that these protesters are calling for?
Well, let me say, first of all, that the Thai government support the right for the people to demonstrate peacefully. And we also understand that there are different opinions from different group of peoples. So the governments will have to listen to all sides of the people so that the conflicts and the confrontation in the country by the different groups will not happen. And in terms of the monarchy, the reform or whether the demand by the demonstrator, that will be invited to the reconciliation committee, which is already set up by the parliament.
There was a reconciliation committee, though, back in 2017 with the same people in power. What makes you think this will be any different this time?
We are optimistic that the current government, including the current parliament members, they have different group of peoples, and they will discuss peacefully, and they will discuss in terms of their difference, so that the conflicts will definitely be listened from all sides, and the result will be a resounding and a happy one for everybody in the country.
I want our audience, though, to understand a little bit more about what the frustrations are with the monarchy. So King Vajiralongkorn, his leadership style was very different from his father, King Bhumipol. King Bhumipol was seen as a benign leader, basically adored, revered by the public. But since taking the throne in 2016, King Vajiralongkorn has, among other things, he's had the constitution changed to give himself greater levels of authority. He's taken over certain army regiments, so they essentially report directly to him, basically making them kind of like a private army. He spends much of his time in Germany, and he's estimated to have brought at least $30 billion in royal assets meant for the benefit of the Thai people under his own control. So you talk about this reconciliation committee. Do you understand why for the protesters that may not be enough? They want the power of the monarchy to be reduced.
Well, as I said to you earlier, that all the discussions will need to come to the table under the reconciliation committee so that all the differences will be discussed. And the issues will be, let's say, putting out by the House speakers who is in charge of the moment of this mechanism. And I'm sure that it will be listened by all sides, including the government, including the group of people who also have their opinions different to the current demonstrators.
The protesters specifically, their frustration is actually directed much more at the government than at the monarchy. They're not calling for the king to step down. They are calling for the Prime Minister to actually resign. So do you think his time has run out? You keep talking about reconciliation, but do you think his time has run out?
Well, this government, first of all, I have to point out that come to power democratically under the current constitution. So that means it's a bit irony that the demonstrator is asking the government to resign because the terms so far, usually there will be 4 terms before the next election.
You talk about the fact that that all these elections have happened with this constitution that people voted on, but the prime minister came to power through a military coup 6 years ago. When elections were finally held, his party did not even win the most seats in the election. It came in second, but because of the way the election is set up in the party's favor, it only needed 126 seats in the lower house for Prayut to remain as prime minister. So any other party would have needed 376. That's a big difference, right? So does he really have democratic legitimacy when it seems to all have been tilted towards him before people even went to vote?
Well, let's say that before this constitution is being used at the moment, there were referendum by the people of Thailand, and the referendum is clearly show that they accepted and they would like to have this constitution in place. So that have to understand.
But I do want to stop. I want to stop you for just a moment. That when you talk about the referendum, any effort to even monitor the referendum to make sure it was free and fair, that was blocked. Campaigning against the referendum was banned. You detained and charged those who did. Was there really a national dialogue about this when it seems that voices were repressed?
No, I say that the referendum was democratically went into the vote of the people. And those people who try to, let's say, campaign against or with the Constitution, if they do so in a normal manner, that's not against the law, they have no problem with that.
But on April 19th, the General Prayut, he actually said, opponents of this draft constitution, this is a quote, have no rights to say they disagree. I don't allow anyone to debate or hold a press conference about the draft constitution. They still must obey my orders. They will be arrested and jailed for 10 years. No one will be exempted when the Referendum Act becomes effective, not even the media. That is repressing dissent.
Well, as I said, that is, I'm not sure about the actual date, what happened and when he said that.
But he did say it. I understand that, but I am telling you, he did say that.
Okay. So, but the referendum actually gone through and it's approved by the people. So, and he's been using the law and the constitution under that current one for already 2 years, almost 2 years. And there is no problem at all until at the moment that the demonstrator start to have their disagreement with a lot of things, and their demands are also at the first, when they start their demonstration, there are also many other demands that is not talking about the constitution only, but about other things like the economics issues, about social issues, about the inequality. There are so many issues.
I want to talk about the way authorities have been responding to the protests. It has been heavy-handed. In October, Prelude actually issued an emergency decree banning large gatherings. The publication of so-called sensitive news sent riot police into the streets. More than 175 people have been prosecuted for illegal assembly or sedition. That's just since July. Last month, at least 55 people were injured in one day when police used water cannon laced with purple dye and tear gas on peaceful protesters outside Parliament in Bangkok. The Office of the UN Secretary General sharply criticized this. So these protests are led by students, young people. In some cases, there are children present. You keep saying that you're open to reconciliation and dialogue, but why is the government treating the protesters this way?
Well, we do not disperse the crowd if they are peacefully demonstrate. That is one thing I have to stress. And you will see that most of the demonstration around the country, whether it's in Bangkok or in the province, we try to have the police to look after the safety of the protester and at the same time to look after the safety of the public. So there is no confrontation at all between the protester and from different group of demonstrators who have different ways of trying to expressing themselves.
Let's talk about lèse-majesté. So this is Thailand's law against insulting the monarchy. It is among the harshest in the world. The UN Human Rights Committee has referred to the sentencing practices around lèse-majesté as extreme and a violation of international law. In fact, 16 of the leaders of these current protests were actually charged just within the last month. And people have also been charged under these other vaguely worded laws for expressing dissent. Can you provide any assurances that the government will not continue to use these laws to crack down on opposition?
Well, at the moment, the current law and the constitution is still being used or in place. So I think the government and also the police will also have to do their best to make sure that all the law and all the demonstrations are doing peacefully under the rule of law of Thailand, of the current law. And dialogue is the best way to iron out the difference, and the difference of opinions can just come to the conclusion easier rather than on the street, but in the room where we have the group of people who have different opinions to decide and finally conclude on how to go forward.
So you keep saying dialogue. I hear you, I do. But there can only be a healthy dialogue when people are not afraid. And at least 9 critics of the government or the monarchy have gone missing in the past 2 years, in some cases, even after they fled to neighboring countries. 2 of them were later found dead. Their bodies were stuffed with concrete on the banks of the Mekong River. These are people the government was actively trying to get extradited back to Thailand. Can you say for sure that the government had nothing to do with the disappearance or killings of these people that are critics of the government?
Well, I don't want to address or mention about any particular case in what you have just mentioned, because there were many cases that still ongoing on investigation. But at the moment, the government tried to make the atmosphere of the society that we need to trust each other. If we don't have the trust, then we cannot come to
True, but you do. But if
yes.
there are people that are turning up dead, people that are critics of the government, surely you can understand why there might not be a lot of trust. So my question again is, can you for sure say the government had nothing to do with these disappearances and killings?
As I said, it's under the police investigation at the moment. So I don't want to comment on that, or even some cases they are in the court procedures at the moment. And I think it's inappropriate for me to comment on any particular case that you have just mentioned.
All right, that will be the final word. Anucha Burapachaisri, thank you so much for joining us here on UpFront.
Thank you.
And that is our show for now, UpFront. We'll be back next week.